In the wealthy suburban outskirts of New York, where gated mansions lined the streets and luxury cars filled the driveways, there was one estate that stood out from the rest, the Crawford Elite Kennels. This high-end breeding facility belonged to Richard Crawford, a ruthless businessman who had built his fortune by producing the finest pedigree dogs in the country. Richard wasn't just a breeder, he was a strategist, a businessman with an obsession for perfection. Every dog in his kennel was bred, trained, and selected for Westminster-level competitions. His Labrador retrievers weren't just pets, they were champions, show dogs that brought him prestige, trophies, and most importantly, money. This morning, like every morning, Richard walked through the long rows of kennels, his sharp eyes scanning the litters with a calculating gaze. He was dressed in his signature navy blue suit, a stark contrast to the rugged surroundings of the kennel. Beside him, his assistant Mark Lancaster, clipboard in hand, kept pace, ready to jot down every command. Richard stopped suddenly. His piercing blue eyes narrowed as he pointed toward a whelping pen where a golden-furred female Labrador, Grace Goldenstar, lay nursing her newborn puppies. Grace was one of his top show dogs, a multi-time champion, flawless in every way. Beside her, resting against the straw bedding, was the father of the litter, Black Tornado, an imposing black Labrador with a perfect stance and muscular frame. But Richard wasn't admiring his prize-winning breeding pair. He was inspecting the litter, and what he saw didn't please him. "These are the offspring of my champions." Richard's voice was cold, edged with disappointment. He stepped closer, studying the three tiny puppies curled up against their mother's belly. Mark hesitated before responding. "Yes, sir. They were born early this morning." Richard knelt, his expression unreadable as he observed them. The puppies, barely a few hours old, were still fragile, their eyes tightly shut, their bodies trembling slightly as they huddled for warmth. "Look at their legs," Richard muttered. He pointed at the smallest puppy, a cream-colored one with a distinctive white marking on its forehead. "Too thin. That one won't develop strong muscle tone." He gestured toward the golden-colored puppy beside it. "That one's posture is weak. It lacks confidence." Then he turned his attention to the largest of the three, a solid black puppy that seemed slightly stronger than the others. "Maybe this one has some potential. But the other two? Useless." Mark shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, they're only a few hours old. With the right care." Richard cut him off with a sharp glare. "I don't waste resources on weaklings." He stood up and dusted off his hands, as if touching the puppies had dirtied him. "Get rid of them. I want them gone by tonight." Mark hesitated. "Are you sure? We could sell them as pets." "I don't sell defective dogs, Mark," Richard snapped. "Crawford Elite Kennels breeds champions, not liabilities. If word gets out that my dogs aren't perfect, my reputation will suffer. And I don't tolerate failure." Grace, the mother, let out a soft whimper, nudging her puppies closer with her nose. She didn't understand the harsh judgment that had just been passed on them. She only knew they were hers, and she would protect them. Richard turned on his heel, already moving toward the next pen. "Take care of it," he ordered. "And don't make me ask again." That evening, under the cover of twilight, a battered old pickup truck rumbled down a deserted dirt road near the edge of town. In the back, tucked inside a small crate, were the three tiny Labrador puppies, their bodies still trembling from the cold. Mark sat in the driver's seat, gripping the wheel tightly. His orders were clear: dispose of the puppies. But there was something about the way they looked at him, something in the way the mother, Grace, had whined as he carried them away, that made him hesitate. He wasn't a cruel man. He had worked for Richard for years, but this felt wrong. Instead of dumping them in an isolated area as instructed, he made a last-minute decision. Pulling over near a quiet residential area at the outskirts of the city, he carefully placed the crate near an abandoned shed, hoping someone would find them. "They deserve a chance," he whispered, before driving away, leaving the puppies to fate. Not far from where the puppies had been left, Sophie Matthews was finishing her daily run. She had grown up in this neighborhood, a quiet, middle-class area on the edge of the city, and despite her modest lifestyle, she had always dreamed of something greater. Sophie was a dog lover through and through. Ever since she was a child, she had spent her free time volunteering at shelters, training rescue dogs, and learning everything she could about canine behavior. Her dream was to become a professional dog trainer, but without the funds for formal training, she was stuck working at a local pet store, barely making ends meet. As she jogged past an old shed, something caught her ear, a faint, desperate whimper. She slowed down, heart pounding, and turned toward the sound. What she found made her gasp. A small crate sat in the shadows, and inside, huddled together for warmth, were 3 tiny Labrador puppies. Their eyes were barely open, their fragile bodies shivering from the cold. Sophie didn't hesitate. She knelt down and carefully unlatched the crate. "Hey there, little ones," she murmured, her voice gentle and soothing. "Who left you out here all alone?" The smallest puppy, the cream-colored one with the white marking, hesitantly sniffed her hand before nestling against her palm. Sophie felt an overwhelming sense of determination settle in her chest. Someone had abandoned them, but she wouldn't. Cradling the crate in her arms, she whispered, "You're safe now. I promise." As she carried them home, she had no idea that these 3 tiny creatures would soon change everything. They weren't just lost puppies. They were destined to be champions. And Sophie was about to prove the world wrong. Sophie Matthews walked into her small 1-bedroom house, balancing the crate of shivering puppies in her arms. The moment she stepped inside, she set them gently on the warm living room floor, her heart still pounding from the unexpected discovery. Her home wasn't much, just a cozy space she rented on the outskirts of the city, with creaky wooden floors, secondhand furniture, and walls decorated with dog posters and training guides. She may not have had a mansion like the elite breeders in town, but she had something far more valuable, a heart big enough to love and care for any dog, no matter where they came from. She knelt beside the crate and unlatched the door. The 3 tiny Labrador puppies hesitated before crawling forward on unsteady legs, sniffing their new surroundings. "Hey, little ones," Sophie whispered softly. "You're safe now. Let's get you cleaned up." She quickly gathered some old towels and a warm bottle of milk, knowing that puppies this young still needed gentle feeding. As she placed the bottle near them, the black one, the strongest of the 3, was the first to step forward, his tiny nose twitching as he took a hesitant sip. "You're a brave little guy." Sophie smiled, stroking his head. "I think I'll call you Thor." The golden-furred puppy followed cautiously, his eyes wide with uncertainty as he sniffed the bottle before beginning to drink. "And you remind me of fire, fast but careful," Sophie murmured. "You'll be Blaze." The smallest puppy, the cream-colored one with the white mark on his forehead, was more hesitant. He stayed close to the crate, trembling slightly, watching his siblings drink. Sophie reached out, offering the bottle just a bit closer. "Come on, sweetheart. I know you're scared." After a long pause, the little puppy finally inched forward, taking small sips from the bottle, his tiny paws pressing into her hand. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" Sophie whispered, a soft smile on her lips. "I think I'll call you Star." She sat there for a long time, gently petting each puppy, letting them know they were safe. And deep inside, she knew these weren't just any puppies. They had a story to tell, and she was going to help them write it. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of care and learning. Sophie dedicated every free moment to feeding, comforting, and watching over the puppies. Thor grew quickly, his solid black coat gleaming, his energy endless. He was the first to run, the first to bark, and the first to investigate new things. Blaze was cautious but lightning fast, darting around playfully whenever he felt safe. Star, though the smallest, showed the most determination, always the last to give up, always watching, always learning. By the time they were old enough to start basic training, Sophie was already thinking ahead. "You guys aren't just going to be great dogs," she told them one morning, watching as they chased each other in the small fenced backyard. "You're going to be champions." But first, they had to learn. Training puppies wasn't easy, especially when she had to balance her job at the local pet store with raising them. But Sophie had dreams of becoming a professional dog trainer, of one day competing at a level that people like Richard Crawford would never expect from someone like her. She started simple, teaching them to sit and stay, helping them grow confident with basic commands, introducing them to small agility obstacles, just tiny hurdles and tunnels in the backyard. At first, Thor was wild and impatient, often charging ahead before Sophie even finished a command. Blaze was more thoughtful, but hesitant, always double-checking before making a move. And Star? Star was the hardest to train, not because he was weak, but because he watched and thought too much sometimes overthinking commands instead of reacting instinctively. Sophie never gave up on them. Every morning before work and every evening after her shift, she trained them, played with them, encouraged them. And slowly, they changed. Thor learned to focus his strength and follow commands instead of just charging ahead. Blaze grew more confident, realizing that speed was his strength. And Star? Star learned to trust himself. One day, as Sophie stood at the edge of the yard, she watched as all three puppies took on their first full agility course, a few hurdles, a tunnel, and a small ramp leading to a platform. And they nailed it. "You're ready," Sophie whispered, her heart racing. "You guys are really ready." It wasn't long before people in town started to take notice. At first, they laughed at the idea that three abandoned puppies could ever be trained for serious competition. But when they saw how quickly Thor, Blaze, and Star were mastering agility courses, the laughter turned to curiosity. Even the local dog trainers, people who had dismissed Sophie as just a pet store worker, started paying attention. One day, a representative from the 𝐥𝐤𝐬𝐤 National Agility Championship came to watch them train. He was skeptical at first, but by the time Thor leapt flawlessly through the final hoop, Blaze raced through the tunnel without hesitation, and Star executed a perfect final jump. He was nodding with approval. "Sophie," he said, "these dogs could compete at a national level. You should enter them into the 𝐥𝐤𝐬𝐤 Agility Championships." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment she had dreamed of. But there was one person who wouldn't be happy about it. Word spread fast. The idea that some nobody from the suburbs was about to compete against the top breeders in the country was a scandal. And soon, the news reached Richard Crawford. Sitting in his sleek, glass-walled office in Crawford Elite Kennels, Richard stared at the computer screen. The email subject line read, "Former Crawford puppies to compete in 𝐥𝐤𝐬𝐤 Agility Championships." His jaw clenched. It couldn't be them, could it? He clicked the attached video, and there they were. A massive black Labrador, a golden streak of speed, and a cream-colored underdog with a white mark on his forehead. The same three puppies he had discarded. His face darkened. His pride wouldn't allow it. "Mark," he barked, calling for his assistant. Mark stepped in cautiously. "Yes, sir." Richard leaned forward, his fingers steepled. "Find out everything about this Sophie Matthews. Where she trains, where she lives, everything." Mark hesitated. "Sir, do you really think?" "I don't think," Richard snapped. "I act. Those dogs should never have left my kennel, and I don't intend to let them beat me." Mark nodded stiffly and left. Richard sat back, watching the video again. His blue eyes burned with anger. If those dogs thought they could escape their past, they were wrong. Because Richard Crawford always took back what belonged to him. The day Sophie had dreamed of for so long had finally arrived. A thick envelope from the 𝐥𝐤𝐬𝐤 National Agility Championship lay on her small wooden kitchen table. Inside was an official invitation, congratulating her on qualifying for the upcoming regional trials, the first step toward competing on the national stage. Sophie could hardly believe it. She looked down at Thor, Blaze, and Star, who sat obediently at her feet, their tails wagging as if they knew what was coming. "We made it, guys," she whispered. Thor let out an excited bark. Blaze's ears perked up. Star, the ever-watchful one, stared at her with those sharp, knowing eyes. But excitement wasn't the only thing swirling in Sophie's chest. The competition was in 2 months, which meant one thing. Training would be harder than ever. Sophie had spent the last year training the dogs in her backyard agility course, but she knew that wouldn't be enough. If they were going to face the best in the country, they needed to train like champions. She reached out to Coach Riley Anderson, a well-known agility trainer who ran a proper facility outside the city. Riley was tough, experienced, and had coached multiple winners at national-level agility events. When Sophie told her story about finding Thor, Blaze, and Star abandoned, and how they had grown into top agility dogs, Riley had agreed to help train them. But she had one condition. "If you're serious about competing," Riley had said, "you have to be ready to push yourself and your dogs to their limits. No excuses. No breaks. This isn't just about running an obstacle course. It's about mental endurance, speed, and trust." Sophie had nodded without hesitation. "We're ready." But she had no idea just how hard things were about to get. From the very first session at Riley's training facility, it was clear that Sophie and her dogs were out of their depth. Unlike their simple backyard setup, Riley's agility course was brutal. higher jumps that required maximum precision, longer tunnels designed to test speed and focus, sharp, rapid turns that demanded perfect coordination. The first few weeks were exhausting. Thor, normally the strongest, struggled with tight turns and almost crashed into a hurdle during the first full-speed run. Blaze, though fast, hesitated too much, overthinking his jumps and slowing down at critical moments. Star, always the underdog, had the hardest time keeping up with the pace of the intense training. Even Sophie felt the pressure. She wasn't just training them, they were training her, too. Every movement, every command had to be precise. If she made even the slightest mistake, the dogs would pick up on her hesitation. One evening, after a particularly rough session, Sophie sat on the grass, exhausted, watching her 3 dogs panting beside her. "Maybe we're not ready," she muttered under her breath. That's when Riley walked up, arms crossed. "You think champions are born?" Riley asked, her voice calm but firm. Sophie shook her head. "No, I know they're made." Riley nodded. "Then make them. No more doubts. No more second-guessing yourself. You got into this competition because you belong here. Now prove it." Sophie exhaled slowly. She looked at Thor, Blaze, and Star, 3 abandoned puppies that no one believed in. She owed them everything, and she wasn't about to let them, or herself, fail. The next morning, everything changed. They trained harder, smarter, stronger. Thor mastered his sharp turns, learning to use his strength more efficiently. Blaze conquered his hesitation, turning into a blur of speed. And Star? Star began to trust his instincts, moving like a dog who knew he was meant to win. By the end of the 8-week training, they were no longer just competitors. They were champions in the making. But while Sophie and her dogs were training, someone else was watching. Richard Crawford sat in his office at Crawford Elite Kennels, his fingers drumming against the polished wood of his desk. Across from him, his assistant Mark Lancaster stood stiffly, holding a folder. "Well," Richard's voice was dangerously calm. Mark swallowed. "She's training with Riley Anderson. She's serious about competing, sir." Richard let out a slow, calculated breath. "So the girl thinks she can win." Mark hesitated. "Her dogs are good, sir. Really good." Richard's jaw tightened. He didn't like this. Not one bit. If those 3 dogs, his dogs, stepped into the competition and won, it would be an embarrassment. A humiliation. People would talk. They'd say he was wrong to throw them away. They'd say Sophie Matthews, a nobody from the suburbs, had outtrained the greatest breeder in the country. That couldn't happen. He wouldn't allow it. Richard stood up, adjusting the sleeves of his expensive tailored suit. "Find a way to stop her." Mark frowned. "What do you mean, sir?" Richard turned to face the large window overlooking his state-of-the-art training grounds. "I don't care how you do it, but I want her out of that competition. Do you understand?" Mark hesitated for just a second too long. Richard's cold stare made the hesitation disappear. "Yes, sir." As Mark left the office, Richard smirked. He had built his empire by playing dirty, and he wasn't about to stop now. Back at Riley's facility, Sophie stood beside her dogs, her hands shaking slightly as she opened a new envelope. Inside was the official confirmation letter. She and her dogs had officially qualified for the regional agility trials. The competition was only a few weeks away. She felt a surge of excitement and nerves. This was it. Everything they had trained for led to this moment. She looked at Thor, Blaze, and Star. "We're one step closer, guys." Star let out a small bark. Thor's tail thumped against the ground. Blaze gave her a confident stare. They were ready. What Sophie didn't know was that someone was already planning to take that chance away from them. Because Richard Crawford wasn't done with her yet. The morning of the AKC Agility Regional Trials had finally arrived. Sophie stood at the entrance of the massive competition arena, clutching the leashes of Thor, Blaze, and Star. The facility buzzed with energy, trainers leading their sleek, well-groomed dogs across the artificial turf, spectators filling the bleachers, and officials setting up the intricate obstacle courses. It was overwhelming. Sophie took a slow breath, forcing down the nerves that had crept into her chest. This was everything they had trained for. Thor, Blaze, and Star had gone from abandoned, unwanted puppies to championship-level agility dogs. And now, they were about to prove to the world, and to themselves, that they belonged here. She knelt down, rubbing each of their heads. "No matter what happens, we do this together." Thor barked excitedly. Blaze wagged his tail. Star, ever observant, watched the competition field like a strategist analyzing the battlefield. Sophie smiled. They were ready. What she didn't know was that someone else had been preparing for this day too, but not to compete. To destroy her chances before she even got started. Across the field, in a VIP seating area, Richard Crawford watched the competitors enter the staging area. His eyes zeroed in on Sophie and her 3 dogs. It was them. The 3 rejects he had thrown away. And they looked good. Too good. Richard's fists tightened. This was an insult. He was the top breeder in the country, the man whose Labradors dominated the Westminster Dog Show and agility circuits alike. And now, a nobody was about to humiliate him? No, he wouldn't allow it. He turned to Mark Lancaster, his longtime assistant, who sat beside him. Is everything in place? Richard asked, his voice calm but laced with menace. Mark hesitated. Sir, I really think we should. Richard's icy glare shut him up instantly. Mark sighed. Yes, everything's in place. We have a few surprises waiting for them. Richard smirked, leaning back in his chair. Good. Let's see how well her mutts handle a real challenge. The first round of the competition was a timed agility course. Each dog would have to navigate a series of jumps, tunnels, weave poles, and ramps as fast as possible. Thor was up first. Sophie led him to the starting position, crouching down beside him. Okay, buddy. This is just like training. Focus, stay with me, and let's win this. Thor wagged his tail and locked onto the course ahead. He was ready. The whistle blew, and they were off. Thor launched forward, clearing the first set of hurdles with his usual power. He hit the weave poles next, his massive frame twisting through them with surprising speed. The crowd cheered. He was flying through the course. But then, the balance ramp. As Thor sprinted toward it, something was wrong. The moment his paws touched the plank, it tilted awkwardly, sending him skidding sideways. Gasps rang through the stadium. Sophie's heart froze. Thor barely managed to scramble back up, his footing shaky, before leaping off the end of the ramp. He finished strong, but Sophie knew the error had cost them time. She rushed to his side, checking him over. He seemed fine, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the ramp had been tampered with. Next was Blaze. Sophie tried to shake off her nerves, but doubt had started creeping in. Had Thor just misstepped? Or had something been done to the equipment? She didn't have time to dwell on it. The whistle blew, and Blaze shot forward like a rocket. He dominated the jumps, his natural speed giving him an edge. The weave poles. Flawless. But then came the tunnel section. Blaze darted inside, but never came out. Sophie's pulse skyrocketed. What was happening? Then, a whimper. Sophie rushed forward, crouching near the tunnel's entrance. Blaze. Come on, boy. Nothing. With growing panic, she crawled forward, and then she saw it. The tunnel was wet. Someone had poured water inside, making the ground slippery and disorienting. Blaze, already hesitant with confined spaces, had panicked. Sophie clenched her teeth. Someone was trying to sabotage them. She didn't have proof, but she knew. With a soft, encouraging voice, she coaxed Blaze forward. He emerged, shaken but unharmed. But their time had taken a huge hit. Sophie's stomach tightened. This wasn't bad luck. Someone wanted them to lose. And she had a very good idea who. By the time Star was up, Sophie's heart was pounding. 2 strange incidents back to back? This wasn't a coincidence. She crouched next to Star, stroking his head. Listen, buddy. I don't know what's happening, but I need you to focus. Just do what we trained for. Star stared up at her, his wise eyes filled with quiet confidence. Then he turned to the course, as if he already knew what was coming. The whistle blew, and Star took off. The first set of jumps? Perfect. The A-frame? Smooth as ever. The tunnel? He blasted through without hesitation. Then came the final jump, a large hurdle leading into the finish line. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. This was it. Star sprinted forward, and at the last second, his paws skidded slightly. His body tilted midair. But instead of falling, he twisted his legs, correcting himself mid-jump, and nailed the landing. The crowd erupted. Sophie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Even with the slip, Star had still finished fast. But had it been fast enough? Richard Crawford sat in his VIP section, his face like stone. Everything had gone according to plan. The tampered balance ramp, the wet tunnel, the slippery jump. And yet, that cream-colored mutt had still pulled off a near-perfect run. Richard's fingers tightened around his glass of whiskey. This wasn't over. Mark hesitated beside him. Sir, Despite everything, Sophie still placed in the top ranks. She's moving on to the next round. Richard's jaw clenched. He had thrown everything at them, and they had survived. Now he had only one choice left. Then we'll make sure she doesn't reach the national finals, he said coldly. Mark swallowed hard. He had seen that look in Richard's eyes before, and it meant something dangerous was coming next. After the rankings were announced, Sophie sat in her car, her hands gripping the steering wheel. They had qualified for the next stage, but barely. The sabotage had nearly ruined everything, and Sophie knew only one man was behind it. She looked at Thor, Blaze, and Star, all curled up in the back seat, exhausted but still full of heart. No more games, she whispered. Richard Crawford had tried to break them. Now it was time to fight back, and she wasn't going down without a fight. Sophie sat in her car, the rhythmic sound of Thor, Blaze, and Star's steady breathing filling the silence. The regional trials were over. They had qualified, barely, but something wasn't sitting right. Sabotage. She had seen it in Thor's misstep on the balance ramp, in Blaze's panic inside the slick tunnel, in Star's last-second skid before the final jump. These weren't accidents. Someone had tried to take them out of the competition, and Sophie had no doubt who was behind it. She gripped the steering wheel, jaw clenched. Richard Crawford, the man who had discarded her dogs like trash, was now trying to destroy them, because they had dared to succeed without him. Well, he was about to learn something. She wasn't backing down, and neither were Thor, Blaze, and Star. The next morning, Sophie arrived at Riley Anderson's training facility early. The regional trials were over, and now it was time to prepare for nationals. But before she could even begin training, a sleek black Mercedes rolled up outside. Her stomach twisted. She already knew who it was before he even stepped out. Richard Crawford, dressed in a crisp navy suit. He adjusted his expensive cufflinks before stepping toward her with that arrogant smirk she had seen too many times in interviews. Behind him, his assistant Mark followed, looking uneasy. Sophie crossed her arms. "What do you want, Crawford?" Richard let out a slow chuckle, as if she had just asked something ridiculous. "Oh, Sophie," he said smoothly. "Is that any way to greet an old friend?" Sophie's expression didn't waver. "We're not friends, and I know what you did." Richard's smirk widened, but his eyes remained cold. "You know, I've been watching you and your dogs." His gaze flicked toward Thor, Blaze, and Star, who stood alert behind Sophie. "I must admit, I didn't expect much, but they've surprised me." Sophie clenched her fists. "Cut the act, Richard. You sabotaged my runs at regionals. You think I don't know?" Richard sighed dramatically, shaking his head. Sophie, always so emotional. Let's assume, for a moment, that I had something to do with your little accidents. What exactly would you do about it?" Her nails dug into her palms. "I'd beak you. Fair and square." His smirk vanished. For the first time, something dangerous flickered in Richard Crawford's eyes. He took a step closer. "There is no fair and square in this world, girl." Sophie refused to back down. "Then you're going to hate losing to me." Richard held her gaze for a long moment. Then, slowly, his smirk returned. "I was going to offer you a deal," he said smoothly. "You see, I hate wasting resources. Those dogs were mine once, and I'm willing to overlook past mistakes. I'll write you a check, any number you want. Walk away, and let them come back where they belong." Sophie felt her pulse spike with anger. He still thought he could buy them. Still thought they were nothing more than a business deal. She took a step forward, looking him dead in the eye. "You don't deserve them." Richard's expression darkened. Then he let out a low chuckle and adjusted his sleeves. "Fine," he said, voice ice cold. "Have it your way. But let me give you some advice, Sophie." His smirk was gone now, replaced by something far more menacing. "I never lose." With that, he turned, walking back to his Mercedes. Mark lingered for a moment, looking almost guilty before following him. As they drove away, Sophie's hands shook with rage. Thor let out a low growl. Blaze's ears pinned back. And Star stood perfectly still, watching the car disappear, as if he understood exactly what kind of man Crawford was. Sophie took a deep breath. "We don't need to fight dirty," she murmured to her dogs. "We just need to be better." And they would be, no matter what Crawford threw at them next. With only 4 weeks until the AKC National Agility Championship, Sophie doubled down on training. Thor's strength. They worked on tight turns and balance exercises, making sure he wouldn't be thrown off by another sabotage attempt. Blaze's speed. They pushed his reaction time, training him to sprint without hesitation through tunnels, even when unexpected distractions were added. Star's precision. Star was already Sophie's most technical dog, so they focused on split-second adjustments, preparing for any surprises on the course. They trained at Riley's facility, and each session pushed them further than ever before. But the harder they trained, the more Sophie felt something was off. She could feel it, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Something was coming, and she wasn't wrong. Late one evening, after an exhausting training session, Sophie was packing up when Riley called her into the office. Her mentor's face was unreadable. "Sophie, I need you to hear me out before you react." Sophie frowned. "What's wrong?" Riley sighed, running a hand through her short, graying hair. "I got a call today from someone offering me a lot of money to convince you to drop out of nationals." Sophie's stomach dropped. "Richard?" Riley nodded. "I told him to go to hell, of course. But that's not the worst part." Sophie's pulse pounded. "What is?" Riley slid a piece of paper across the desk. A signed contract, with a familiar name at the bottom. Mark Lancaster, Richard's assistant. Sophie's heart sank. Mark had been working for Crawford for years. But when she had seen him hesitate before, she had hoped he wasn't as bad as Richard. But this proved otherwise. "He sold us out," Sophie whispered. Riley nodded grimly. "And if he's involved, that means whatever Richard has planned next is going to be worse than what he pulled at regionals." Sophie's jaw tightened. She wasn't afraid of Richard Crawford. But now she knew. This wasn't just about the competition anymore. This was about power, control, revenge. And Richard wasn't going to stop. Not until he won. Or until Sophie made sure he lost. She stood up, her entire body humming with determination. "I don't care what he does," she said. "We're going to nationals. And we're going to win." Riley watched her for a moment, then nodded. "Then let's make sure you're ready." Because one thing was clear. Crawford wasn't done. And the real battle hadn't even begun yet. The day had arrived. The AKC National Agility Championship, the biggest agility competition in the country, was in full swing, and the air buzzed with excitement. Spectators filled the massive indoor arena, cameras rolled for live broadcasts, and the best-trained dogs from across the nation prepared to prove themselves. But for Sophie Matthews, this wasn't just about winning a trophy. It was about proving that Thor, Blaze, and Star belonged here. It was about standing against Richard Crawford's corruption. And most of all, it was about showing the world what second chances could do. She tightened her grip on Star's leash, glancing at her dogs. Thor stood tall and proud. Blaze's tail flicked anxiously, and Star, her little underdog, watched the course ahead with unwavering focus. This was their moment. But deep inside, Sophie knew Crawford wasn't done yet. Somehow, someway, he'd find a way to strike again. High above the competition floor, in one of the private VIP booths, Richard Crawford sat like a king overlooking his kingdom. His best agility dogs were competing today, dogs bred from elite bloodlines, trained in state-of-the-art facilities, and prepared for absolute perfection. And yet, all anyone could talk about was Sophie Matthews and her three nobody dogs. It made him sick. Mark Lancaster stood behind him, shifting uncomfortably. "Sir, Sophie's dogs have qualified for the final round. They made it past every elimination." Richard's fingers tapped against his glass of whiskey, his expression dark. He had tried to buy them back. Sophie refused. He had tried to sabotage their regionals. She fought through it. Now, she was standing at the finish line, and there was only one thing left to do. He looked at Mark, his voice calm and deadly. "Make sure they don't win." Mark hesitated. "Sir, we already tried." Richard's head turned slowly, his cold blue eyes sending a clear message. Mark swallowed hard. Understood. The final course was brutal. A twisting maze of jumps, tunnels, ramps, and weave poles, designed to test not just speed, but precision and teamwork. Each dog had to run individually, with their total times combined. Crawford's dogs had already run the course flawlessly, setting an almost impossible time to beat. Now, it was Thor, Blaze, and Star's turn. Sophie crouched beside Thor, stroking his head. "This is it, buddy. No distractions. Just you and me." Thor let out a low, determined bark, eyes locked on the course. The whistle blew, and he exploded forward. Thor charged down the track, his powerful legs propelling him over the first jumps with perfect form. Hurdles? Cleared effortlessly. Weave poles. A little tight, but smooth. Tunnels? a blur of black fur flashing through. Then, the balance ramp. Sophie's stomach tightened. This was where he had almost slipped last time. But Thor didn't falter. He had trained for this moment, and he nailed the ramp perfectly before leaping into the final sprint. When he crossed the finish line, his time was incredible. The crowd roared. Sophie exhaled. 1 down, 2 to go. Blaze was up next. Sophie took a deep breath, kneeling beside him. You've got this. Don't hesitate. Just run. Blaze licked his nose nervously but squared his shoulders. The whistle blew, and he shot forward like lightning. Jumps? Flawless. Weave pulls. The fastest of any dog so far. But then, the tunnel. Blaze hesitated for half a second. And in that tiny hesitation, Sophie saw what Crawford had done. Something was wrong inside the tunnel. Maybe it was a scent, a sound, something only a dog could detect. Blaze's instincts told him not to enter. Sophie's heart pounded. If he hesitated too long, their time would be ruined. Then, a soft bark from the sidelines. Star. Blaze's head flicked toward him. Then, with a burst of courage, he charged through the tunnel. Sophie cheered as he flew toward the final jump, clearing it with barely a second to spare. They were still in the race. Now, everything came down to Star. Sophie knelt beside Star, pressing her forehead gently to his. You know what to do, buddy. Star stared at the course. Then, something shifted in his expression. It was as if he already knew this was his moment. The whistle blew, and Star took off. Every jump, perfect. Weave poles, flawless. Tunnels. He ran through them without hesitation. Then, the final jump. Sophie's pulse spiked. She had seen this trick before. Crawford had done something to the final hurdle. Star sensed it too. But instead of hesitating, he did something unbelievable. He adjusted his steps mid-run, shifting his weight at the last possible second. Then he jumped. For one heart-stopping moment, Sophie thought he wouldn't clear it. But Star twisted in the air, correcting himself, and landed perfectly. The crowd erupted. Sophie choked back a sob of pride. Thor, Blaze, Star. They had done it. Richard Crawford stared at the scoreboard. Sophie's team had finished with the fastest total time. She had beaten him. His fingers tightened around his glass, but his expression remained unreadable. Mark hesitated. Sir, what do we do now? Richard exhaled slowly. Nothing. Mark blinked. But Richard turned away from the arena, adjusting his expensive cufflinks. We lost. Mark froze, as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. Richard Crawford never admitted defeat. But there it was. Still, he wasn't finished. Not yet. As he left the stadium, he muttered under his breath. This isn't over, Sophie Matthews. Sophie stood on the winner's podium, the gold medal around her neck, her arms wrapped around Thor, Blaze, and Star. They had done it. They had proven themselves to the world. But more importantly, they had proven themselves to each other. Crawford had tried to break them. But in the end, all he had done was make them stronger. As the national anthem played, Sophie whispered to her dogs. We did it, guys. We're champions. And for the first time in their lives, they were exactly where they belonged.